The fluorescent lights hummed their endless monotone as Katie Morrison moved through Seattle General's ICU at 5:30 in the morning, restocking supply carts with the kind of precision that made the work invisible. Bottles of saline solution aligned perfectly. Sterile gauze pads stacked in identical squares. Syringes arranged by gauge size, 25, 23, 20, each one slotted into its predetermined slot. The antiseptic smell burned the inside of her nostrils, that sharp chemical bite she'd learned to breathe through in places where the smell of antiseptic meant you were lucky enough to have a functioning hospital at all. Room for 12 had a patient whose blood pressure had been trending downward for 6 hours. Katie had noticed it yesterday during the swing shift when nobody else was looking close enough. She checked the monitor now, pulled up the trend on the computer, and made a note on the paper chart that the resident would probably ignore. She'd learned not to speak unless asked. Learned not to volunteer information in a way that made people uncomfortable. Learned that competence without pedigree made certain doctors feel threatened in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Her left leg ached. It always did on cold mornings. The limp was barely perceptible now, 3 years of physical therapy had seen to that, but the muscle memory of the injury lived in her joints, a reminder that some damage never fully resolves, just gets managed. She favored her right shoulder unconsciously, a habit so ingrained she wasn't aware she did it anymore. The scar tissue underneath her scrubs, beneath the collarbone, pulled tight when she reached for the 4 pumps. That one had come from a different kind of accident. The kind that happened in Fallujah when you were the only medic still conscious after the convoy got hit. The break room was empty at this hour. Katie hung her jacket on the back of a metal chair and touched the inside lining where the unit patch sat, faded now to colors that barely existed anymore. 1st Medical Battalion, Fallujah. The stitching was coming loose at the corner. She'd sewn it in herself 17 months ago, right before she reported to Seattle General with her new nursing credentials and her cover story and her classified mission that nobody at this hospital would ever know about. She pressed her thumb against the embroidery and held it there for exactly 4 seconds. Then she took her hand away and went back to work. The morning shift briefing started at 6:45. Katie sat in the 3rd row of chairs in the conference room, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the whiteboard where the charge nurse was writing room assignments. Most of the ICU nurses treated her the way you'd treat a competent colleague, neutral, professional, sometimes seeking her opinion on labs that didn't quite add up or patients who seemed to be declining without obvious cause. The ones who'd been here longest knew to ask her first. The new ones usually learned eventually. Dr. Pierce hadn't learned yet. He arrived during morning rounds at 7:15, trailing for residents like a general surveying conquered territory. Katie was checking the arterial line on the patient in room for 10, cleaning the insertion site with methodical care, verifying the waveform on the monitor. She didn't look up. The sound of his voice always preceded him anyway, that particular cadence of certainty that only came from people who'd never had to doubt themselves. Ms. Morrison. Not Katie. Never Katie. How long have you been with us? She tied off the dressing and stood, meeting his eyes for exactly 1 measured breath. 3 months, doctor. Community college, if I recall correctly. Yes, doctor. His jaw tightened as if the answer itself was a personal insult. He turned to the residents, gesturing vaguely in her direction. Our support staff here keeps the basics running. Vital signs, dressing changes, the fundamental nursing tasks. Important work, of course, but important in the way that any competent person with proper training can accomplish. Katie returned to her charts. The pen in her hand didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She was a woman who had applied a tourniquet to her own leg while continuing to stabilize a spinal cord injury in another patient. Pain was information, nothing more, and she could certainly survive the condescension of a surgeon who'd never operated anywhere except inside climate-controlled operating rooms that smelled like fresh paint and ambition. But that wasn't the worst part. An hour later, as she was restocking the code cart and running through the mental inventory she kept of every piece of equipment in this unit, the ER doors burst open. The sound came first, the pneumatic whoosh of those heavy doors, the rattle of a gurney at full speed, the specific cadence of paramedics calling out vitals in that practiced rhythm that meant someone was actively bleeding out. Katie's coffee cup, sitting on the counter in the break room, would grow cold without her? Her hand stilled over the airway management kit. Incoming GSW, the overhead called. Military transport, critical condition. She didn't move. Not yet. That was how you stayed invisible. You waited for the official assignment. You didn't volunteer. You didn't rush. You proved nothing to nobody. The paramedics wheeled past the ICU entrance less than 30 seconds later, their radio traffic overlapping with hospital frequency in that controlled chaos that meant the patient was still viable. Katie caught a single piece of information in the transmission, Navy, medical priority, and her chest tightened by exactly 0.5 millimeter. Katie. It was Sandra, the charge nurse, already on her way past. They're taking the GSW to Trauma 1. But we're setting up a probable ICU admission in room for 15 once they stabilize him. I need you to get that room ready. Full isolation protocol. They're being cagey about the patient, but the Pentagon called ahead, so apparently he's important. The Pentagon. Katie was already moving, pulling clean linens from the supply, her hand steady, her breathing the same rhythm it had been 5 seconds ago. The room got prepared with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory and training, isolation precautions, fresh equipment, backup units for everything critical. She checked the ventilator settings. Verified the monitoring capability. Ensured the crash cart was within arm's reach. And she thought about the unit patch in her jacket and the reason it was sewn into the lining in the first place. The reason involved a naval officer named Commander Jake Reese, who was supposed to be in medical observation for a security situation that classified briefings described using words like asset and intelligence priority and embedded operative. Katie's orders had been simple: place as a civilian nurse, gather information on his condition, report to the Pentagon contact number every 72 hours. Maintain cover. Don't engage. Document everything. She had not expected the patient to arrive via ambulance with 5 bullet wounds. Trauma 1 was controlled chaos. She could see into the bay from the hallway, the organized flurry of a full trauma activation, the kind of efficiency that only happened when the patient was critical enough to make everyone forget about hierarchy and ego. Doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, all moving in that synchronized dance of people who'd practiced the same choreography 1,000 times. Force going in. Portable X-ray being positioned. Somebody calling for the blood bank. Katie went back to room for 15 and finished the preparations. The room was perfect now, as perfect as a room could be that was waiting to receive someone you were supposed to monitor without acknowledging you'd ever met them. Which you hadn't. You'd never met Commander Reese. You had no idea what he looked like. Your orders were to observe, not to know. But the Pentagon had called ahead. At 8:45, the ER attending emerged from Trauma 1 and walked directly to the ICU. Katie was running through the last verification checklist in room for 15, and she was far enough away that she could pretend not to be listening when he told Sandra the patient was stable, barely, and would probably be rolling up to the ICU within the hour. Gunshot wounds to the abdomen, left shoulder, right leg, and one that had come close enough to the heart to make the surgeon use words like fortunate and surgical miracle. Military? Sandra asked. Navy SEAL? Commander rank? The attending lowered his voice slightly. His chain of command is already here. Like, federal-level chain of command. This guy's important for reasons nobody's explaining to me. Katie adjusted the monitor one more time. The screen flickered with test patterns, ready to receive data that would tell her everything about a man she wasn't supposed to recognize, wasn't supposed to know, wasn't supposed to have any emotional investment in whatsoever. And she thought about the difference between following orders and following her instincts, between maintaining a cover and maintaining her competence. Between staying invisible and staying alive. The grand rounds began at 7:37 on a Thursday morning, and Dr. Pierce had already decided how the day would go. 12 residents circled bed 7 like medical students at an autopsy, tablets glowing in the sterile light. Katie stood against the far wall, chart in her hands, watching the theater unfold. She'd seen this performance before. Different residents, same choreography. Pierce held her chart like Exhibit A in a trial nobody had asked for. His voice carried the particular cadence of a man used to rooms bending toward his certainty. Pedestrian nursing that mistakes luck for skill, he announced, letting each word hang in the recycled air. The residents shifted their weight, forming the geometry of agreement around him. One of them smirked behind a tablet. Another scribbled notes. Look at the transfusion timing here. Pierce jabbed a finger at the documentation. Community college protocol. Barely adequate. She happened to catch the bleed before it became catastrophic. That's not competence. That's fortune wearing scrubs. Katie took one measured breath. The kind she'd learned in Fallujah when incoming artillery sounded like God clearing his throat. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from shame, not from anger, but from the precise calculation that showing nothing would infuriate him more than any defense ever could. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. The residents had gone very quiet. Silence in a hospital is always a warning. The patient is alive and stable, doctor. That was all she said. 5 words. No apology. No explanation. No deference wrapped in careful language. Just the fact, delivered with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Pierce's face transformed, a thunderhead shifting across his features. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. That's exactly the arrogance I'm addressing, he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the monitors seem louder. That absolute certainty that protocol doesn't matter because you got lucky. He turned away from her, addressing the residents instead, but everyone in the room understood he was still speaking to Katie. Documentation is authority. Credentials mean something. They have to mean something, or we're no better than faith healers in a tent. He flipped through the chart with deliberate slowness, each page a small condemnation. The residents nodded in synchronized understanding, the way people do when the powerful have already decided what true means. Katie didn't flinch. Didn't lower her gaze. Didn't let the smallest tremor of resentment cross her face. She'd held that kind of composure while pulling wounded from a burning convoy under direct fire. She could hold it for Dr. Pierce. She was holding it now, and that, more than anything, was what made him truly hate her. The vending machines hummed their electric monotone on the 3rd floor, a sound so constant most people stopped hearing it. Katie stood before them on day 3, selecting her coffee with the deliberate precision she applied to everything. 2 surgeons had materialized on either side of her without announcement, drawn to the space like iron to magnetic north. Dr. Pierce was speaking to them, his voice pitched to Carrie. I'm genuinely questioning whether community college nurses should handle critical cases anymore, he said, as if Katie were a case study rather than a person standing 3 feet away. The coffee cup trembled slightly in the surgeon's hand, not from the coffee maker, but from the sudden understanding that he'd walked into an ambush. The credentialing standards have fallen so catastrophically that we're essentially gambling with patient safety on credentials printed from a computer. Katie completed her selection. The coffee dropped with a mechanical thud. She turned with that same steady gaze, that same composed breathing. She said nothing. Which meant Pierce had to keep talking, keep pushing, keep trying to wring some response from her that would justify his contempt. He stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell the cologne beneath the hand sanitizer, could see the capillaries breaking in his eyes from whatever sleepless nights consumed him. You keep overstepping, Morrison. Every protocol I establish, you decide doesn't apply. Every authority I exercise, you ignore. His voice had dropped to something colder than volume. I will have security escort you out of this hospital if you keep exceeding your scope. Do you understand me? Katie nodded once. The gesture was neither acquiescence nor submission. It was acknowledgement of information received. Yes, doctor. 3 words. Delivered in a voice that could have been addressing a junior enlisted sailor who'd already heard the briefing 3 times over. Pierce's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted her to protest. To defend herself. To cry. To shatter the way he imagined she should. Instead, she stood before him like someone who'd already endured worse than words, and that unshakable certainty, the kind that only comes from actual competence, from having held lives together in the dark, was the thing that made him most want to destroy her. He walked away. She heard his voice carrying down the corridor, already reassigning patients, already beginning the systematic architecture of her professional demolition. By mid-afternoon, the charge nurse at the central station had received 3 requests to remove Katie from high-acuity cases. Pierce explained it with the careful language of a man building a paper trail. Morrison needs remedial supervision before handling complex patients, he told the charge nurse, speaking slowly as if translation were necessary. She's competent with simple cases, but I have concerns about her judgment in critical situations. I'd prefer to keep her on stability monitoring. Lower stakes. Fewer variables. The charge nurse glanced up from her screen toward Katie, who was updating Commander Reese's chart at the corner desk. Katie didn't look up. She just kept writing with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything. Her full-line assessment notes. Her vital sign trends. Her medication reconciliation. Each entry perfect. Each notation defensible. The charge nurse shifted several critical assignments to less experienced staff members. Katie accepted the changes without comment. But that wasn't the worst part. An hour later, Katie was updating the foresight on Commander Jake Reese when the ER medic rotating through the ICU for cross-training froze mid-suture on the patient in the adjacent bed. His name was Mitchell. His call sign was Breaker. His unit patch on his civilian jacket read 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He watched Katie's hands as she cleaned Reese's insertion site, as she assessed the surrounding tissue with the economy of motion that only comes from muscle memory deeper than a decade. The way she clamped a bleeder. The way her fingers anticipated what the tissue would do. The way she never wasted movement. The way she moved like someone who'd done this before, done this under fire, done this while rounds were coming in from the rooftops. Jesus Christ, Breaker whispered. He stepped closer to Reese's bed, his voice dropping. You served in Cuna, didn't you? Katie's eyes met his for exactly 0.3 of a second. She shook her head once, almost imperceptible. Not denial. Just a request for silence that carried the weight of operational security. He hesitated, then nodded, a SEAL who understood the geometry of classified cover, who recognized the discipline required to maintain it. But the seed was planted. He kept glancing at her hands as she worked. The way her movements told a story that her mouth couldn't tell. The way her competence carried the accent of somewhere much darker than a civilian nursing school. The recognition was building behind his eyes like a question he wasn't allowed to ask. Katie finished her assessment. Reese's vitals were stable. Still critical from the 5 7.62mm rounds that had entered his abdomen and chest cavity over Helmand Province, still requiring every clinical skill she possessed, but stable. His eyes tracked hers as she adjusted his morphine drip. She gave him the smallest nod. A promise. Not a word, but the kind of promise that matters to men who've learned to read silence. The hospital shifted into its afternoon rhythm. Monitors beeped in their algorithmic chorus. The fax system pushed conditioned air through vents that nobody ever cleaned. Somewhere down the corridor, a code blue was called, then called off. The machinery of healing and dying continued its ancient work, indifferent to whether the people inside it understood who they actually were. Katie checked Reese's dressings one more time. The bleeding had stabilized. His color was better. Whatever Pierce had done today, whatever small humiliations he'd engineered and whatever reassignments he'd made, none of it would matter if Reese didn't wake up. None of it would matter if she lost him. Everything else was noise compared to that single, terrible pressure. She didn't know, as she walked back toward the central station, that the next 48 hours would shatter every remaining illusion of control. She didn't know that in exactly 847 minutes, a man in civilian clothes would push through the ICU doors with violence in his posture and a 9mm pistol in his jacket. She didn't know that she would bleed across the linoleum floor of the hospital she'd served in silence. She didn't know that keeping her composure would cost her more than any breakdown ever could. She just kept working. Just kept her voice level and her hand steady and her eyes forward. Just maintained the cover that no one had clearance to penetrate. Just survived another day pretending to be someone she wasn't while being exactly who she'd always been. The ICU door swung open at 11:08 p.m. Not the normal way. Not a cart with supplies or a resident doing rounds. The man in civilian clothes moved with the precision of someone trained, eyes fixed on bed 4, hand already reaching inside his jacket. Katie felt the shift in air pressure before anyone spoke. Muscle memory recognized it. Threat assessment. Target acquisition. The nurses scattered like startled birds, one knocked over and forced stand, another hit the call button and ran, but Katie didn't run. She stepped between the man and Commander Reese's bed. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just positioned herself in the geometry of survival, same way she'd positioned casualties under fire in Sanjin Valley. The man hesitated for maybe 2 seconds. That was enough. Katie's eyes met his and held, steady as surgical steel. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. He saw something in her face that told him she knew exactly what he was and what he wanted. He fired twice anyway. The first round caught her low in the abdomen, a punch that felt like being hit with a baseball bat made of ice. The second came fast, struck her right shoulder, spinning her backward. Real blood spread across her scrubs like watercolor on silk. Pain was information. Pain is data. Oxygen saturation matters more than pain. Reese matters more than pain. Katie collapsed, but her falling hand, trained across 847 combat missions to complete the objective even while dying, found the panic alarm and triggered it. Her fingers pressed the button. She felt the mechanical click through her palm. The alarm wailed. That sound. That specific, piercing, electronic shriek that meant everything was breaking down, meant the room was about to fill with authority and bodies and noise, but none of that mattered because the button was pressed and that was the mission. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. The sound of running. The ventilator beside Reese's bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to blood spilling across linoleum. Katie pushed herself up on her uninjured side, her left hand moving with terrible, beautiful precision. She had maybe 4 minutes before real shock set in. Maybe 5 if the bleeding held. She reached for the tourniquet kit hanging on the wall behind her and did something that defied every protocol, every standard of care, every regulation that said a wounded nurse should lay still and wait for help. She didn't wait. Her right shoulder screamed, bone-deep, electric agony that made her vision gray at the edges, but her hands moved anyway. 14-gauge needle, pressure bandage, the compression tourniquet above the wound site just below her collarbone. Her military training didn't fight the pain. It used it. Channeled it into precision. And Commander Reese was hyperventilating. His stitches were straining. His EKG was climbing into territory nobody wanted to see, heart rate 154, ragged, irregular, the rhythm of a man whose nervous system had decided this was the moment everything ended. Katie's voice cut through the chaos like a command on the radio. Not loud. Soft. Absolute. You're safe, Commander. For in, for out. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold. Release for 4. She was speaking to him from the floor, one hand applying pressure to her own abdomen, the other still working the tourniquet, but her voice carried no strain, no blood, no wound. Just the calm precision of someone who had coached dying men back from the edge of psychology into basic biology. In. For counts. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song. Hold. Reese's breathing synchronized with her voice. His heart rate began dropping, 147, 143, 138. Not perfect. Not even close to stable. But alive. Trajectory was alive. Out. And release. The doors burst open. Security first, then 2 ER residents, then a surgeon Katie had never seen, then Dr. Pierce. He stood in the doorway and took it all in. A nurse on the floor, blood pooling around her like she'd been dropped from a great height. Gunshot residue still hanging in the air like invisible smoke. 2 exit wounds on a SEAL who needed to stay alive for reasons Pierce didn't know and would never know. And Katie, face pale, hand steady, talking Reese through his panic attack while her own arm was hanging at an angle that suggested structural damage to the shoulder joint. Pierce's jaw tightened. For just a moment, his face showed something close to confusion, like he was trying to make the scene fit his understanding of her and it wouldn't fit. Then something darker moved behind his eyes. Not concern. Not the instinct to help his own staff member who was actively bleeding out. Calculation. He pulled his phone from his pocket while the attending surgeon was still running toward Katie and Reese. While security was still clearing the hallway. While the panic alarm was still shrieking its one-note warning. First call. Voice level, professional, every word precise. Chen. It's Pierce. We have a serious incident in ICU 4. A shooting. Morrison engaged in vigilante behavior that endangered the entire floor. I need this incident formally documented. Pause. Yes, I'm aware we have an active shooter protocol. The point is her judgment was unstable. She positioned herself as some kind of, I don't know what. Security theater. I need this on record that I was concerned about her fitness for duty. The surgeon was cutting away Katie's scrubs. Residents were moving with controlled urgency. Katie felt the cool touch of gauze, the sting of betadine, the temporary numbness of local anesthetic being injected into her shoulder. She didn't look at Pierce. Didn't acknowledge the call. Just kept breathing with Reese. In. For counts. Hold. Release. Second call. This one to a Denver police detective who'd arrived with fire department paramedics. Pierce stepped into the hallway to take it, voice dropping just slightly. Detective. Pierce. The nurse who was shot, Katie Morrison, you should know her background is military. I'm not suggesting anything specific, but she has connections we don't understand. Her presence on this case might be worth looking into. I can't prove anything, but her behavior before the incident was erratic. Questions about her judgment are reasonable to pursue. He paused. I'm just a concerned colleague. I want to make sure we're asking the right questions. Katie felt the paramedics moving her onto the stretcher now. Her blood had soaked through 4 pieces of gauze and was starting on a 5th. Shock was creeping in, the feeling like her extremities were becoming suggestions rather than certainties. But her voice remained steady as the gurney moved. Commander. I need you to understand something. What happened here was not your responsibility. For in. For out. You're going to keep breathing. Third call came as they were wheeling her toward the surgical elevator. Pierce dialed HR directly, his voice taking on that tone he'd used during grand rounds, the one that made young doctors straighten in their chairs. HR Dr. Pierce. I'm formally requesting that Katie Morrison be immediately restricted from all patient floors pending investigation. Tonight's incident demonstrates unstable judgment. Her military background, her overly aggressive response to a security threat, the way she positioned herself, these are red flags we need to address administratively. I want this documented as my recommendation. Yes, tonight. Effective immediately. He hung up before HR could ask questions. The elevator doors opened. Katie was wheeled inside beside an open 4 stand, and the last thing she heard before the doors closed was a young SEAL medic, Breaker, the one who'd started asking questions about her field technique, approaching Pierce with anger crossing his face like a storm front. That woman just saved the commander's life. She positioned herself between him and your temporary staff. Pierce cut him off. His voice was pleasant again, which somehow made it worse. This doesn't concern you. The elevator descended. Katie stared at the ceiling tiles passing overhead, 847 of them according to the building blueprint she'd memorized on day 1, and understood with the clarity that comes from blood loss that everything was about to change. The shooter had come for Reese. But Pierce had just fired at her credibility. Two different wars. Two different rooms. Both of them very, very real. Surgery lasted for hours. Trauma team pulled one round that had nicked her subclavian artery, another centimeter, and she'd have bled out before the first ambulance arrived. Repair with a synthetic graft. Shoulder reconstruction. 214 stitches total. The trauma surgeon, a woman named Holloway who'd served as a flight surgeon with the Army, had looked at the precision of Katie's self-tourniquet and said quietly while signing the post-op orders, "You've done this before. Not to yourself. But you know how." Katie didn't answer. Just accepted the pain medication and the 4 antibiotics and the restriction from duty. Over the next 48 hours, Pierce moved with the efficiency of someone playing chess on a board only he could see. The 3 nurses who most frequently helped Katie, who'd started asking her advice on difficult cases, who'd begun gravitating toward her during shifts, were reassigned to permanent night rotation effective immediately. The surgery schedule for Commander Reese's follow-up procedures was altered. Katie's name was removed from the care team. Reese would recover, but Katie wouldn't be there to monitor it. New complaints appeared in her file. Patient safety concerns. Aggressive behavioral patterns. Questionable clinical judgment. 2 days after the shooting, an HR representative arrived at Katie's apartment with an official letter. She read it from her couch, her right arm in a sling, her abdomen wrapped so tightly that taking full breaths felt like negotiating with her own ribs. Pending investigation, the letterhead read. Effective immediately. Captain, no. Not Captain. Ms. Katie Morrison. Ms. Katie Morrison is restricted from all patient floors pending a formal review of incident protocols and staff conduct. She was barred from the hospital. Barred from Reese. Barred from the operation she'd been placed here to complete. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, 1st Medical Battalion, Fallujah, the words barely visible where she'd stitched them in a Denver hotel room 9 months ago, suddenly felt like it belonged to someone who didn't exist anymore. Dr. Pierce's phone calls came with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The first landed at 8 in the morning, his voice smooth as oil when the hospital administrator picked up. Katie wasn't there to hear it, but she would learn later that he described her actions as vigilante behavior masquerading as heroism, that he questioned whether a nurse without proper credentials should ever be left unsupervised with critical patients, that he used the phrase "a liability we can't afford" 3 separate times. The administrator listened. The administrator took notes. By 10 o'clock, that conversation had already begun its work. The second call came at 11. This one to the Denver Police Department's Investigations Division. Pierce spoke to a detective who didn't know him, didn't owe him anything, but who listened anyway as he suggested, very carefully, very reasonably, that the shooting incident might warrant closer examination of whether the nurse had somehow provoked the situation, whether her presence in the ICU had escalated rather than de-escalated the threat. He didn't say she was lying. He just raised questions. Questions were poison. Questions didn't require evidence. They just required doubt, and doubt spread like infection through an open wound. The third call took longer. HR Director Sarah Chen picked up her phone to hear Pierce's voice, clinical and concerned, describing Katie's pattern of military aggression, her inability to follow chain of command, her dangerous solo decision-making. He cited her field tourniquet technique as evidence of unauthorized field procedures, her positioning between the gunman and the patient as security theater conducted by an unqualified nurse. By the time he finished, he had painted a portrait of a liability, not a hero, but a threat. Not someone who had saved a life, but someone who had endangered the hospital. Within 48 hours, the restriction letters appeared in Katie's locker like a court judgment written on hospital letterhead. All patient floors. Access revoked. Pending investigation. She read it twice, the words blurring, her hand steady but her chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with her wounds. Then came the reassignments. The 3 nurses who had sought Katie's advice on difficult cases, Jenny with the shaking hands, Marcus who froze during pediatric emergencies, David who always second-guessed his own clinical judgment, all 3 suddenly transferred to night shift. The surgeon who had mentioned Katie's name as backup for complex procedures found his request denied. The pharmacy director who'd been collaborating with her on medication error prevention was told to redirect all future consultations to other staff. It was surgical. It was systematic. It was the work of someone who understood that credibility wasn't destroyed through direct confrontation. It was dismantled through isolation, through cutting away the connections that made someone valuable, through making sure no one could verify your competence when your voice was no longer in the room. By day 3 after the shooting, Katie hadn't slept. Not properly. She'd tried her apartment for 6 hours and given up staring at the ceiling, the phantom weight of the 2 bullets still pressing against her ribs even though the bandages told her they'd been removed, even though the surgical tape held her together in ways her mind couldn't seem to manage. At 2 in the morning, she found herself driving with no destination, just moving, the highway hypnotic and empty. At 3, she pulled into Rose's all-night diner 6 blocks from Seattle General, ordered coffee she had no intention of drinking, and sat in a booth by the window where her reflection stared back at her like an accusation. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and the ghost of 1,000 cigarettes, even though smoking had been illegal here for 15 years. The neon sign outside bled pink across the black window. Other customers sat hunched over their own cups, a trucker, 2 nurses from St. Luke's on the next shift, an old man who might have been asleep or might have been dead. Nobody looked at anybody. That was the covenant of the all-night diner. You brought your failure, your insomnia, your reasons for being awake at 3 in the morning, and nobody asked questions. Katie's coffee went cold. Steam rose off it like smoke, then faded. In the window's reflection, her bandaged shoulder caught the diner's light. Her eyes looked like they belonged to someone else, hollow, the color of old water. 17 missed calls from her handler, each one a small emergency she couldn't answer. She tried texting once, mission compromised. Recommend reassignment. The response came back within minutes, negative. Hold position. Monitor ongoing. Hold position. As if she had any position left to hold. The faded unit patch was in her jacket pocket, though she hadn't consciously decided to carry it with her. She'd sewn it into the lining 9 months ago in a Denver hotel room, back when Captain Catherine Morrison was real and present and had a purpose that mattered. 1st Medical Battalion, Fallujah. The letters were barely visible, thread-worn and ancient, a ghost of something. Her thumb traced the outline through the fabric. It was supposed to be a talisman. Instead it felt like evidence of a previous life, a life where she'd known how to save people, where her hands had moved with certainty, where other soldiers followed her lead without question. Not here. Not in this diner at 3 in the morning, failing her mission, failing Commander Reese, failing the entire reason she'd spent 2 years pretending to be someone smaller than she was. The waitress, name tag reading Diane, hair dyed a color that nature had never intended, refilled Katie's coffee without asking. Rough night, hun? Not a real question, the kind people asked to fill silence. Katie didn't answer. Diane left her alone, which was exactly what Katie needed and everything she didn't want at the same time. She thought about Reese 3 floors up in Seattle General, probably waking without her there to monitor the subtle deterioration that would come next. The secondary infections. The sepsis that followed major trauma like shadows follow bodies. She'd seen it 1,000 times. She could predict it like weather. And now someone else would miss it because Katie Morrison was sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning, officially unreachable, officially compromised, officially removed from the operation that had defined the last 2 years of her existence. At 0530, she drove back. The staff parking lot was empty except for the night shift nurses' cars and an ambulance bay that never truly quieted. Katie used her restricted access card. It would still work, technically, but accessing any patient floor would trigger the investigation monitors. She took the stairs anyway. The concrete echoed her footsteps up for floors, each step a small rebellion. ICU 4 was dim except for the monitor glow. Katie moved without announcing herself, just another figure in scrubs in the grey hours before dawn. Reese's room was first on the left. She didn't cross the threshold. She just stood in the doorway like a ghost, looking at the data. His 4 fluids were running too fast. His antibiotic schedule had shifted, the replacement nurse had changed dosing intervals. The labs from midnight showed something she'd feared, white count climbing. 23,000 and rising. Temperature spiking. Pressure dropping. Sepsis didn't wait for official authorization. Katie moved. Not thinking about restrictions or investigations or the 17 unanswered calls. Her hands moved the way they always did in crisis. She pulled the lab results, checked his antibiotic concentrations in the hospital database using her restricted access codes that probably weren't supposed to work anymore but did because someone in IT hadn't gotten around to deactivating her privileges. She paged the on-call surgeon. She adjusted the foredrip by hand, steady pressure, knowing exactly how much fluids he could tolerate, knowing his cardiac output had probably dropped 15% since yesterday. Pain was information. This information was screaming. "What are you doing?" Dr. Pierce. Of course. The only person awake at this hour in his own warped routine, haunting the halls like he owned them. Katie didn't turn around. She didn't release the 4-line. His white count is 23,000. Temperature 39.4. He needs immediate intervention or he'll be septic by noon. You're restricted from these floors. Pierce's voice had that quality it always carried, honey and vinegar, the sound of someone who'd won before and expected to keep winning. Security. 2 guards appeared as if summoned. Katie released the 4-line. She turned slowly, meeting Pierce's eyes, and what he saw there made something in his face twitch. Not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe. The sudden understanding that he'd been fighting against something he didn't fully comprehend. But the guards were already moving, already placing hands on her arms, already beginning the machinery of her removal from the hospital. Get her out. Pierce's voice had gone thin, desperate. Now. As they walked her toward the elevators, Katie glanced back once. Reese's monitor still showed those climbing numbers. The infection markers rising like a tide. The elevator doors opened. The guards pressed forward. And then the ER alarm sounded, not the routine code overhead, but the full emergency wail, the kind that meant critical incoming, meant hands on deck, meant every available person needed downstairs in the next 30 seconds. The guards hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, the ER doors burst open below, visible through the railing, paramedics wheeling in a stretcher with a man whose skin was the color of old parchment and whose chest was wrapped in pressure dressings already soaked through with blood. The man's eyes opened. Even from 4 stories up, Katie saw him focus, saw him search the room below, saw the moment recognition lit his face. His lips moved. One of the paramedics bent closer. Then the translator's voice carried up the stairwell, thin and reedy but clear, in accented English that sounded like home, the Angel of Remedy. Every head in the ER turned up. Every head in the ICU hallway turned toward the stairs. The guard's hands loosened on Katie's arms. And in that moment, suspended between the 4th floor and the ground level, between her failure and something she couldn't yet comprehend, Katie Morrison heard her old callsign spoken aloud for the first time in 3 years. Everything was about to change. The paramedic's eyes locked onto hers across the ER. His accent was thick, desperate, broken by trauma. The Angel of Remedy. 3 words. The room crystallized around those words like ice forming on winter glass. Every nurse froze. Every monitor seemed to pause its beeping. Katie's hands, still holding the previous patient's chart, went still. Nobody called her that anymore. Nobody was supposed to call her that ever again. The paramedic's voice cracked as they wheeled him past her. You saved my convoy. You saved my life. 3 times you came back under fire. He was crying now, blood soaking through the gauze on his shoulder, and he was crying because he'd found her. After 3 years in the shadows, the Angel of Remedy had been found in a Denver emergency room wearing scrubs that said her name was just Katie. The room went dead silent. Even the ventilators seemed to hold their breath. Then rubber-soled boots crossed the tile behind her. Slow. Deliberate. Katie didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew the sound of someone moving with military precision, knew the weight of a man who'd spent his life in uniform. Commander Jake Reese limped through the ER entrance supported by an N4 stand, his surgical wound still fresh, his face still marked by the blood loss and sepsis that should have killed him. He wasn't supposed to be on his feet. Against every medical protocol, against the restrictions that had locked Katie out of his care, against the doctor's orders he'd explicitly refused to acknowledge, he'd pulled the monitoring leads from his chest and moved. His hospital gown hung loose over the bandages. The four-line swayed as he positioned himself directly beside her, his presence like a wall of solid certainty. When he looked at the paramedic on the gurney, his eyes said everything. I found her. She's right here. She never left. The paramedic's hand reached across the distance between the two stretchers, and Katie saw the moment recognition became confirmation, the moment a ghost became a person standing in the fluorescent light wearing a name tag that said Morrison. And then the doors opened again. Not the ambulance bay doors. The main entrance. A Marine Corps colonel in dress blue stepped through, his bearing so rigid he seemed to bend the air around him. Behind him came two more officers, and the colonel carried a leather folder that he opened with the kind of precision that belongs only to men who read official citations aloud at ceremonies. His voice carried across the ER without shouting, the kind of authority that doesn't require volume. Captain Catherine Morrison, Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. He paused. Let that sink in. 3 combat deployments. 14 lives saved under direct fire. 2 confirmed instances of returning to active kill zones to extract wounded personnel. The folder caught the fluorescent light. The residents who'd smirked behind tablets during grand rounds now stood completely still. Your cover status ends effective immediately. Your mission is compromised. Your service is acknowledged. Each sentence landed like a boot heel on tile. The ER nurses stared at Katie. Dr. Pierce's name hung unspoken in the air like a toxic smell, because every person in that room understood what he'd done, what he'd been trying to accomplish, and how completely he'd failed to see who he was standing next to. A 2-star general entered through the same doors. His uniform seemed to shift the oxygen levels in the room. Behind him, an aide carried a frame, glass and mahogany, the kind used for ceremonies and permanent displays. Inside the frame, a Navy Cross, its ribbon faded blue and white, the medal itself catching light like a piece of the sky. Below it, a silver star. Below that, 2 purple hearts, each one representing wounds taken in service. Below that, a combat medical badge showing a caduceus over a rifle. The general stepped forward and saluted, not the casual acknowledgement, but the full, formal salute that means respect moves in only one direction. Katie returned it, muscle memory taking over, her hand rising to her temple with the same precision she'd used 1,000 times before the nursing job, before the diner at 3 in the morning, before she'd learned to make herself invisible. The general's voice was quiet. We've been watching what happened here, Captain. The assassination attempt. The breach. The obstruction of your recovery. He gestured toward the frame. These are yours. Officially. For the record now. For the world. He didn't need to say the rest. Everyone in the ER understood, Dr. Pierce had done more than harass a nurse. He'd obstructed a federal operation. He'd attempted to discredit a decorated military officer. He'd put a target on his own back and not even known it. 20 minutes later, in the parking garage beneath Seattle General, FBI agents in dark windbreakers positioned themselves against a silver Mercedes. Dr. Pierce emerged from the elevator carrying a leather briefcase, still in his white coat, still moving with the arrogance of a man who believed his credentials would protect him from consequences. He froze when the agents approached. His mouth opened to protest, to demand to know what this was about, to explain that he had tenure, he had published papers, he had a reputation. The handcuffs went on with the sound of metal closing, definitive, final, like a door slamming on everything he'd built. An FBI agent read from a tablet, her voice clinical as a pathologist's report. We accessed hospital security footage for the last 6 months. You made 17 unauthorized queries of Captain Morrison's personnel file. You attempted to access classified military databases using hospital credentials you weren't authorized to use. You filed false reports with hospital administration suggesting psychological instability based on fabricated evidence. You altered scheduling to remove her from patient care during a critical recovery phase. She paused. Let him see the security footage on the tablet, him making those 3 phone calls, his face contorted with rage, his words dripping poison. You accessed federal databases without authorization. You tampered with a sanctioned intelligence operation. You obstructed Pentagon oversight. The agent's partner opened another file. Your attempt to forge psychiatric evaluations. Your communication with outside parties suggesting Captain Morrison posed a threat to patients. All documented. All preserved. All federal violations. Pierce's hand shook. His fingers twitched toward his briefcase as if his credentials could defend him, as if his Hopkins diploma meant anything against the weight of federal obstruction charges. You're under arrest for unauthorized access to classified systems, falsifying federal documents, and obstruction of justice, the agent said. She read his rights in the flat, practiced tone of someone who'd done this 100 times. The words seemed to bounce off the concrete and come back as echoes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. The walk to the unmarked car took him past every person he'd ever belittled, past the nurses who'd watched him use condescension like a scalpel, past the residents who'd learned his contempt from watching him practice it daily. His Mercedes sat abandoned in the parking space, a $87,000 reminder that status means nothing when federal agents decide you've violated the law. By evening, his physician's license would be under review. By morning, the medical board would have his file flagged for termination proceedings. The Johns Hopkins diploma on his office wall would come down. Whether he took it or the hospital did wouldn't matter much. 6 months later, Katie stood in the Seattle General lobby wearing dress whites for the first time in 2 years. The bars on her shoulders caught the morning light, captain's rank, gleaming, undeniable, impossible to dismiss. Her uniform fit perfectly because her seamstress had tailored it knowing exactly what it represented: service. Command. Authority earned through blood and competence, not credentials and condescension. The lobby had been transformed. Navy flags hung from the ceiling. Dress blues filled the space, sailors and soldiers standing at attention, the entire SEAL Team 7 arranged in perfect formation. They'd arrived 3 days after she took those bullets, exactly as the classified orders specified. She'd never been alone in her recovery. They'd stood watch outside her hospital room, silent as ghosts, making sure Pierce's sabotage couldn't reach her again. Commander Rhee stepped forward, fully recovered now, his movements fluid and strong. A Major General pinned a commendation medal on his chest while a Rear Admiral read the citation aloud: 14 lives saved, 2 confirmed kills of hostile forces during extraction, medical excellence under conditions that would have broken ordinary soldiers. The Iraqi translator whom Katie had pulled from a burning truck 6 years ago stood in the front row, fully healed, tears streaming down his face as he watched the ceremony. The Navy SEAL medic who'd first recognized her technique, Breaker, his call sign had been, saluted her directly, one warrior acknowledging another. Hospital Administrator Chen presented Katie with an offer: Director of Trauma Services, a full colonel's position, the chance to train the next generation of medics and nurses who would understand that heroism doesn't come with a press release or a title, it comes with the quiet decision to save lives when nobody's watching. As the ceremony concluded, a photographer captured the final moment, Team 7 raising their unit salute, their hands moving in perfect synchronization, their eyes forward, their respect absolute. Katie returned the salute, and the photographer caught her reflection in the polished marble floor of the lobby, no longer the ghost staring out a diner window at 3 in the morning, no longer invisible behind a name tag that didn't belong to her, but Captain Catherine Morrison in full dress whites, the angel of remedy finally acknowledged, finally home, finally seen. Through the lobby windows, visible in the parking lot, a medical supply van turned slowly onto the street. A man in an orange safety vest sat behind the wheel, his physician's license revoked, his career ended, his federal conviction a matter of public record. He glanced back at the hospital once, at the flags, at the uniforms, at the gathering of military personnel, and then he drove away into traffic, into obscurity, into the consequence of underestimating someone whose quiet competence had outmatched his hollow credentials every single time. The general's closing words echoed across the lobby as Katie's unit's salute held steady. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The quiet nurse who'd saved her commander twice, once from bullets, once from anonymity, stood at attention while her entire unit honored her, finally, completely, and without apology. If you're enjoying this, please hit like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from.